चलो सीखें एक नया हुनर और चलें काम पर स्किल इंडिया के साथ, जिसकी पहल हो चुकी है प्रधानमंत्री कौशल विकास योजना से। कौशल भारत, कुशल भारत।
Hello and welcome to your first of 3 at-home lectures on blood. So these 3 lectures have been separated into an introduction, which includes just general information about blood and blood components. Then there's a second lecture on erythrocytes, or red blood cells if you will. And there's a third at-home lecture you'll be listening to on white blood cells, also known as leukocytes. So within these 3 lectures, we will be looking at an overview of blood. We'll be talking about the components of blood. We'll talk about a process called hematopoiesis, which is just the fancy way for saying production of blood cells. Then we'll talk about the erythrocytes. That will be in the second lecture that you listen to. And the erythrocytes are the red blood cells. And then in the third lecture you'll be listening to, we'll talk about leukocytes. So, the first thing I want to talk about is what organ system blood belongs to. So your body has many organ systems like the nervous system or endocrine system. You've probably heard of the 2 on this slide, it's the circulatory system and the cardiovascular system. What's the difference between the 2? And which one does blood belong to? Well, there are some differing ideas about what the difference is between the circulatory system and the cardiovascular system. Medical professionals and education professionals can't really agree on the terminology here, so I'm going to present it the way the author of your textbook presents the information, which is actually how most people think of this. The circulatory system is considered to be composed of your heart, your blood vessels, and the blood within your heart and blood vessels. The cardiovascular system, cardio means heart and vascular means vessels. So the cardiovascular system is just your heart and blood vessels, and it does not include the blood within it. So what organ system does blood belong to? Technically, it would be the circulatory system. Hematology is the study of blood. So the next thing I want to talk about are the functions of blood, or you can call these the functions of the circulatory system, since blood is a part of the circulatory system. So we can separate the functions of blood into 3 general categories: transportation, regulation, and protection. So you're probably familiar with some of the things that blood transports. All of your freshly absorbed nutrients that come in through your intestines are transported through your bloodstream. Things like glucose and proteins and vitamins and minerals and water. That's all transported within blood. Blood also transports gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. It also transports waste products. Carbon dioxide is actually a gaseous waste product. Urea is a waste product that we find being transported through the bloodstream. And blood also functions to transport hormones. An example of some hormones you might find in the bloodstream, you've probably heard of adrenaline or insulin. Blood also plays a role with regulation. One of the things that blood regulates that people often don't realize is pH. Your blood does help to regulate your acid-base balance of your body. Blood is a fantastic buffer. A buffer is something that can take in or release acids, if you will, in order to maintain a pH, in order to stabilize a pH. We'll talk more about this later in the semester. Blood also helps to regulate your body temperature. By controlling where your blood is flowing, we can help to regulate body temperature. For instance, when we become very warm, like maybe if we're exercising or something, the blood vessels in our skin tend to dilate so that our very warm blood can come closer to the outside of the body, and then the heat can more easily dissipate from the body. And the opposite happens when we become cold. When we're cold, our blood vessels tend to constrict, going closer to the center of our body in order to hold our nice warm blood towards the center so we don't lose any heat to the outside environment. And then in terms of protection, blood does help for protection. One of the main things at play here are a type of cell in the blood called white blood cells, or leukocytes. white blood cells are very important for helping to prevent or fight off infections, so they can kill things like viruses and bacteria. These white blood cells are also important for initiating something called the inflammatory response. So the process of inflammation, even though it's sometimes painful to us, is actually protective in nature. It helps to prevent the spread of infection. So white blood cells will help to get that process going. Also in the blood, we have antibodies, which help to protect us. Antibodies are proteins that are capable of attacking foreign invaders and clearing those from our body. Additionally, another protective mechanism involving the blood involves platelets. Platelets are small, tiny little things in the blood that help blood to clot. So if you happen to cut a blood vessel, all of your blood doesn't just leave your body through that tiny cut, because your blood will clot, forming a little plug at the area of the break. Next thing I want to talk about are the fluids of the body. We have intracellular fluid, blood, interstitial fluid, also called tissue fluid, and lymph. Intracellular fluid, as the name suggests, is fluid found inside of your cells. Blood, interstitial fluid, and lymph are all extracellular fluids. They're found outside of cells. Blood is the one that we're going to talk about today. I wanted to briefly mention interstitial fluid. This is going to be a sort of clearish fluid that we find between the cells of our body, inside of our tissues. Lymph is actually just interstitial fluid that has moved out of the tissues and into the lymphatic system, the drainage system of the body. I want to talk about some physical characteristics of blood, things like blood temperature. Your blood temperature is technically warmer than your body temperature. Blood temperature is about 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be about 38 degrees Celsius. So it's slightly warmer than normal body temperature. Viscosity is a property that talks about thickness of a fluid. So something like syrup or molasses would be more viscous than pure water. Blood is also more viscous than pure water. Blood viscosity is about 5 times more viscous than pure water. And that's because there are things in the blood other than water, like cells, that kind of add to that thickness. The pH of blood is somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45. And this pH is very important. Variations below 7.35 or above 7.45 can actually lead to death. So your body works very hard to maintain blood pH. In terms of quantity, the typical person has anywhere from 4 to 6 liters of blood, less for a woman, more for a man. And then in terms of blood color, right, all blood is red. The blood in your arteries is red, the blood inside your heart is red, the blood in your capillaries is red, the blood in your veins is red. I happen to have light colored skin, and I can actually see right through to some of my blood vessels in my wrist, and I definitely see blue and green and purple tubes in there. The blood inside of those tubes is red. All blood is red. And the reason for this is because blood contains iron. Iron is actually found inside of your red blood cells. They're called red blood cells because they're red. They're red because of the iron. And maybe you've heard of like soils that are rich in iron have a reddish tint to them. Someone who has red hair has iron deposited in their hair. So iron has a red color. Now it is true that the shades of red can differ depending upon different things being present in the blood. This is very common for oxygen levels. High versus low oxygen levels will change the reddish color of blood. You might get a bright red versus a dark red. But blood is red. Now we're going to talk about the different components of blood. What do we find in blood? So here you can see we have a tube of blood. Okay? And there are 2 major components to blood. Blood plasma and then the formed elements of blood. Roughly about 55% of your blood will be plasma, which is mostly water. And then the remaining 45% will be the formed elements. Formed elements is just a fancy name for cells. They call the cells of blood formed elements. So in these blanks here, so for plasma, I would put about 55% of your blood is plasma, and for formed elements, about 45% is formed elements. So plasma is mostly made of water, but it also contains proteins and other solutes that we'll talk about shortly. In terms of the formed elements, or the cells of blood, we have three major categories: the erythrocytes, which are also known as red blood cells, or RBCs. You can put that in the blank here if you want. The function of the erythrocytes is mostly to carry oxygen, but as you'll find out shortly, they do a lot of other things too. The leukocytes are also known as white blood cells, or WBCs, and their main function is to help fight and prevent infection. And last but not least are the platelets. Sometimes people will call platelets thrombocytes, and their function is to clot blood. So what we're going to do right now is take a look at blood plasma, that 55%. The majority of blood is plasma, okay? And when we look at plasma, we can see that most of plasma, 92% of plasma, is water. So the majority of that is water. But we do have a small sliver of plasma proteins, about 7%, and then something that we call other solutes at 1%. So we're going to start off by talking about those other solutes in plasma. So these are things that we find in plasma that aren't proteins. They include electrolytes, which you've probably heard of. When I hear the word electrolyte, I often think of Gatorade. So electrolytes are found in Gatorade. Electrolyte, as in electricity, these are charged molecules. Things like calcium ions and sodium ions, potassium ions and phosphate ions. So all of these ions have charge. They can carry electricity, hence electrolytes. So we're going to find a lot of these in blood plasma. We're also going to find organic nutrients and organic waste. The word organic in biology and chemistry is a little bit different than the way we use the word organic in agriculture. In biology and chemistry, organic means containing carbon and hydrogen. Okay? So something like glucose, which contains carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, is considered organic. Whereas something like carbon dioxide, which is composed of carbon and oxygen, is inorganic because it's lacking that hydrogen component. Nutrients are things that are required in our diet in order for us to live properly. So the main nutrients are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and then vitamins, minerals, and water. The organic nutrients would include the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the lipids, and then the vitamins also. Whereas water and minerals are considered inorganic. So some examples of organic nutrients that we're going to find in our plasma: glucose, amino acids, which are the things that we use to build protein. We're going to find even organic waste in our plasma, like urea. Urea is a waste product that's produced when we use proteins for energy. The next thing we're going to talk about are blood plasma proteins. That was that 7% of the plasma was composed of plasma proteins. But before we talk about the plasma proteins, I think it's very important to review proteins first. What are proteins made of? How do our cells make proteins? That sort of thing. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to pause this video and then answer the following questions. So the next 3 slides have 9 questions about proteins. So using your book or the internet or any resources that you would like, please answer these review questions. And once you've reviewed proteins, then you can come back to the video and complete this lecture. Okay, so hopefully you've finished your review on plasma proteins, and now I'm going to talk about, finished your review on proteins, and now I'm going to talk about plasma proteins, which are the proteins that we find in the blood plasma. The majority of the proteins that we find in plasma are albumins. And we're going to talk about these more later in the semester. These proteins are very important for water balance, actually. So they help to regulate how much fluid is in your blood versus out of your blood. So they're very important. Globulins are just a general group of proteins, and they have a wide variety of functions. Just to give you an example of a globulin that you might have heard of are the immunoglobulins. Immunoglobulins are also known as antibodies, and these are proteins that help us to fight off foreign invaders in our body. Fibrinogen is a plasma protein that's important for blood clotting. When you break a blood vessel, the fibrinogen is actually converted into something called fibrin. And fibrin is this really stringy, sticky protein that forms a mesh network at the area of your broken blood vessel, and it traps a bunch of stuff in it, forming a clot so that all your blood doesn't leak out through that broken blood vessel. You might have heard the term blood serum before. Sometimes if a doctor requires a certain blood test, the blood test might require that the clotting factors be removed. So blood serum is what we call the blood sample once the clotting factors have been removed. So things like fibrinogen are removed in order to make blood serum. Enzymes are just molecules that speed up chemical reactions, and most enzymes are made out of protein. And there are many different types of enzymes that we find in blood plasma. Just to give you an example of one, there's an enzyme called ACE, ACE, and it's an abbreviation for the angiotensin converting enzyme. And this particular enzyme is very important with helping to regulate blood pressure, actually. And last but not least, hormones. Now, not all hormones are made out of protein. Some hormones are made out of lipids. But to give you a few examples of some proteins that we could find in blood plasma that are hormones, would include insulin, which helps to regulate blood glucose levels. Actually, I think that's probably the best example right there. Okay, the next thing we are going to talk about are the formed elements of blood. So now we're leaving blood plasma, and we're going to talk about the formed elements of blood. So that basically is the cells of blood. So when we look down here, we see that the formed elements of blood are composed of platelets, white blood cells, and red blood cells. And by far, most of these are the red blood cells. 99.9% of your formed elements in your blood are the red blood cells. So less than or around 0.1%, not even 1%, but 0.1% of your formed elements are the white blood cells and platelets. So here's a picture of your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. Red blood cells mainly function to carry oxygen. Right? They all look relatively the same. We have different types of white blood cells, however. And you notice that in this picture, none of them are white. It's because they've all been falsely stained in this picture, so it makes it easier for us to identify them and see them. But there are many different types of white blood cells, and they all have their own functions, which we'll talk about in our white blood cell or leukocyte lecture later. Up top here, you see the formed elements known as platelets. They don't look like a typical cell. They don't have a nucleus inside. They're just little bags of cytoplasm with a little cell membrane around them. And in their cytoplasm, they contain components that are necessary for blood clotting.